Now, we've had a huge number of guests on, and you're name dropping a fair bit, which is getting a little bit embarrassing. We have great feedback from a lot of our listeners about what they learned from some of the top people, what works and what doesn't work in their environment.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company, helping companies fix vulnerabilities in their open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. SNYK.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, is joined by VP of Developer Relations, Simon Maple. Simon takes the role of host in this episode and chats to Guy about the key 2020 podcast themes. They discuss the importance of security champions and celebrating success, as well as what we can look forward to in 2021. Measuring our security programs will be a hot topic, as well as how we can adapt our cloud security practices to help developers secure their infrastructure as code.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of The Secure Developer in 2020. Welcome back to regular listeners, and thanks for tuning in. Today, of course, I'm not Guy Podjarny. Of course, I'm not. My name is Simon Maple. I'm going to be your host for a very special episode this time around, where we take a look back at 2020. And this time, me being the host, joining me as our amazing guest is the man himself, Guy Podjarny. Guy, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Getting used to the change of roles here.
I know. Did you like the intro? Did I get that right?
Spot on, as always.
Excellent. So, Guy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because you don't normally introduce yourself too much on the podcast, right?
Yeah, I think, I wonder how many listeners actually know this. So, I am the founder and president here at Snyk, and I'll spare you the whole history element of it. But I started this podcast about 4 years ago, and the rest is history.
Awesome. Well, this is the second time we've done this together, in fact, where we've taken a look back at the previous year. And let me give you some stats. It's always interesting to hear the stats at the end of the year. And this year, we actually really did ramp up the number of episodes and the number of people that we had on the podcast. Yeah. So in 2020 overall, which was a little bit of a roller coaster ride for many reasons, of course, as we all know. But this year, we did 38 episodes, which is almost double, in fact, our previous year in 2019. It's much more work to actually find and get all the speakers as well to do all the recording. So amazing number of episodes. And in fact, 42, which is double the number of guests that we've had on the podcast as well. So really great to see the podcast growing so fast. Okay, so let's jump straight back into looking back at 2020. So in terms of some of the recurring messages that you heard about and you spoke with many of your 42 guests around, what were some of the themes and recurring discussions that you had across those 38 episodes?
Well, there were many, many of those. It's still kind of a little mind-blowing that we've done 38 episodes. So there were a lot of recurring themes. The one that really jumps to mind at the top is security champions. That went from maybe a casual mention in the 2019 episodes that maybe started building momentum to being very, very kind of common mention in the 2020 episodes. I think it was about 8 different guests described their security champions program. And we also did, one of our sort of experimental kind of mix and match episode, meshing them together. So I think it's been very clear that security champions is a good program, a good means that people appreciate in how to scale security and really kind of help amplify the team. And the practices are forming. You see some recurrence, you see some methodologies that get repeated from guest to guest, but it's still quite a flex. Security champions, definitely a big deal. And I liked some creativity over there, like Jeff at Medallia talked about how they give Stanford credentials to the security champions that go through the training of the program. And at Twilio, I think Yash was talking about how they cycle through the security champions and where people get that type of role. And they do also have a progression path. There was also a lot of commentary about the separation between security communities that just allow developers that care about security to congregate and share practices, from actual security champions program where they actually are expected to spend a certain percentage of their time on security and have some formal interactions. So I'd say security champions is sort of at the top.
This is always very interesting because I'm hearing more and more about how our customers at Snyk, as well as people in general, are using more and more security champions in their development organizations. Is there any parallels that can be drawn against other different testing environments? Do you also see HA champions or performance champions or any other champions in other disciplines that you see existing in the development organizations?
I think the term champions has somehow, it might be security specific. I haven't heard it in other contexts, but I think what you do hear about is you hear it about guilds or other terms like that. You talk about a front end guild or the likes. And in fact, I believe Mike at Square talked about how it's called a security guild for them. So you do have this notion of communities of practice or of sets of people that have a certain competency and they share it. I think what's a little bit different in security is that security augments that with an expert body that sits off to the side in the actual dedicated security organization. And you don't see quite as much of that going on, but it's all shaping up. So maybe some of this will expand to other fields, and definitely security has more to learn. So I think if security champions kind of at the top, another key theme that I've heard was celebrating success, and this one almost had a wave. I used to hear a lot more about it at the beginning in the early episodes. And then somehow in 2019, it came up. There were definite mentions of celebrating success, but maybe it wasn't quite as strong a theme. It came up in kind of full force in 2020. To an extent, it came in the context of COVID as well, when people are talking about how do they keep people encouraged. And there's a lot of favorites in this theme. I think I really liked Mike Hanley from Duo talked about them actually building like a little neighborhood friendly bot there that if someone was first to patch or first to do something that is security conscious would tell them good. And they had all sorts of other kind of recognition elements. I had an episode that I was really happy about with Kyle Randolph from Optimizely, who was at Optimizely. He was the very first guest on the podcast. And then he came on 4 years later to talk about it and talked about how those security hero t-shirts that they gave to encourage developers back then were a hit. But over the years, is also kind of systemized and scales and realized that sometimes celebrating success is as simple as recognition in some public forums. Probably the most sort of structured and large scale variant of this sort of recognition and celebrating success came from Roland Cloutier, who was the chief security officer at ADP. He's since moved on to be the CISO of TikTok. On one hand, they have these CISO awards that anybody can give anybody, these types of thank you awards, which are great, but also introduce all sorts of kind of gamification and encouragements that are, again, on that recognition. So those are three. It actually came up a lot more than those three, but I think celebrating success and recognizing developers that sort of do well about security has really kind of come up as a strong theme as well.
That's a really superb thing as well, because I think the number of pressures on a developer for the amount of time they spend on different things, and very heavily with developers, particularly when back in the day when I was actually writing code. Can you believe that, guy? Back in those days, the
dangerous days. Man.
It was very dangerous for all. But yeah, the pressures on a developer to actually just deliver on time, irrespective of quality half the time, right? It's extremely important to get those features out. So to recognize things which aren't necessarily directly focused on the functional requirements almost of a specific feature is extremely important. I think it's excellent that's
absolutely. It can even be perceived the other way around. If you don't recognize it, you're almost penalized for spending time on security versus on the things that you all recognize. So you really have to balance it out if you are to get your developer team to engage and actually play ball as part of building security. Those are probably the two primaries on the sort of the dev side. I think there have been a couple of interesting ones on maybe more the sort of the ops and security side, the other piece. So definitely a lot more conversations about cloud native security this year. We have quite a few mentions about DevOps as a model for security, which I love. I've always kind of loved DevOps analogies. I think security is kind of walking in the footsteps of DevOps in many, many different ways here, trying to embed security into dev. Jin Kim told a whole bunch of stories about different companies that are kind of walking through it and embracing it. I loved his mention of flow from DevOps and applying it to security, talking about allowing developers to stay in the flow and how that helps organizations embrace DevOps and do that successfully. If you think about that, all the operable things, can you make them a natural part of the developer flow? And then how can you apply that to security? So that was a good DevOps analogy. Security chaos engineering, I love security chaos engineering. It just sort of feels like such a promising methodology. Chaos engineering as a whole. We had both Kelly Shortridge from Capsule 8 and Aaron Reinhardt, who actually kind of built chaos engineering solutions. Both of them talked and gave some great tips about how do you embrace these attacks so you can actually test if your system is resilient to attacks, whether ops or security. That's why the term attacks is actually used for chaos engineering, even regardless of security. So using that, so that was great. And we also had kind of a little bit more on the sort of the softer side. I guess the Jin Kim is also on the softer side or process side, with 10X, who really 10X is this sort of modern banking surrounding, and Neil Drennan there was the CTO, really basically embedded security. The only methodology in which security is tracked from a dev team perspective is in the same agile meetings, same place that they measure all these other aspects of their quality. So a lot of that DevOps practices and how do they embrace them and how do you kind of have security come along? I guess next to that, on the cloud native front, there was maybe some specific focus on cloud security. And I think that was probably one of the messier topics this year in terms of people not really having an answer to it. If last year it was containers, this year I think it's more cloud security, where there was definitely a lot more mention of cloud security. How do you kind of rein in the sprawling assets of your sort of cloud setups? But also I think as companies embrace infrastructure as a code more and developers engage more with it, it really becomes hard to define, or necessary as well, to define the developer's role in this cloud security setup. We've seen some examples of this. So we had Erkang Zhang, who's from Lifomic, and they built this tool called Jupyter-1, which is in the space. They've since spun that out. So that's actually its own company right now. And they talked about how the CMDB, the config management database, the sort of this repository of assets that you have, how is that working in a cloud surrounding? Developers need to engage it. We've seen Spotify open source Backstage, which is a system that also tries to sort of deal with that type of management of assets. We had Terry Radichel talk about understanding that cloud security starts with cloud architecture, and that in turn is in the hands of the developers. This whole cloud native theme, whether as a helper with DevOps methodologies applied to security, but also kind of the messiness a little bit, especially when it comes to cloud security and infrastructure as code, was definitely a topic this year.
And I don't want to almost preempt some of the future questions, but in terms of the cloud security, obviously, you mentioned this is something which is a little bit messy this year. Obviously, cloud's been around for so long now. You're heavily talking about the infrastructure as code part of that, right? Is this something that you see being much more solidified going forward in 2021?
I think so. So the bigger picture is really, I mention it occasionally on the episodes, but the world of cloud has kind of messed up the lines between IT and development. A lot of responsibilities that used to be in the realm of some central IT organizations have now become capabilities that are provided as a service, whether it's part of your infrastructure as a service or a SaaS capabilities. And those are now application services. They're controlled, they're configured, they're run by developers. But it's a new realm of responsibility for developers. It's not something that they're familiar with. And it's also new to the people on wherever it was that those assets were managed before. So I think last year we talked a lot about sort of VMs and containers, and how containers are much more an evolution of the app than they are necessarily an evolution of the VM, but they feel like an evolution of VM. It feels like IT used to manage the operating system and patching it and all of that, and they still do for VMs. And in containers, it's most natural to kind of just move on and think the same way and just apply your VM security practices to your containers. And it takes a moment to realize that it doesn't work that way, that containers are defined in a Docker file that sits in a repo and they're patched by running a build, and that you have to sort of embrace more of a developer approach to it. And I think this year I haven't really heard any disagreement on that front. So I think that's accepted. So cloud security and infrastructure as code, I think it's not just the infrastructure as code piece, it's the fact that developers need to have a role here, right? When you start embracing Terraform or Kubernetes configurations or Helm charts, what you're doing is you are moving decisions from about cloud assets, about knowing what's there, into the realm of development. But it doesn't fully move to development, it's just partially moved to development. So the industry kind of needs to work through it. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of those conversations in 2021. I don't know that it's a one-year resolution. It might also be the theme in 2022. And it has at least two pieces to it, which is the sort of the infrastructure as a code piece, and how does that relate to manual changes? I think that's hopefully the key theme in 2021. How do we secure these decisions as part of infrastructure as code? And then it also has this whole CMDB of who's managing the assets, what's where. And I think that's a slightly more nascent stages type problem. So maybe that's the 2022 piece.
And we always talk about how the development teams change and how the development role has to adapt to accept all these different things, security included. But what about the security team? Have you seen this much change in the way the security team works over the last year?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a ton of conversations about those this year, and I've seen it, through Snyk customers, through sort of reading in the industry, and definitely through the guests on the podcasts. Part of it is what I was alluding to now, which is when something transitions, both parties needs to be, when new responsibility transitions to dev, it doesn't fully transition. So security needs to be there. I think what's been acknowledged this year is that there was a certain critical mass of movement, and that security teams don't need to just tactically deal with container security or cloud security or whatever at dev, but they actually need to restructure. And again, this is something that there were mentions of it in 2019. Justin Somaini from Box is now at Unity. He discussed this probably most succinctly in 2019, but in 2020, it came up a lot. We had Adrian Ludwig from Atlassian talked about their product security team. In another conversation we had at Nikon, actually mentioned how they have a product security team that includes both the cloud pieces of the dev team as well as the application security, anything around product security. But when they advertise for roles, they advertise for application security teams, because otherwise they get product managers applying for the roles, which goes to show that they think that this is the right terminology. And various others, I think Yasha Twilio also, they called it product security. Others embrace that term, but the industry isn't used to it. But that's sort of one aspect of it, which was the scope of how do the teams structure. Application security is historically about vulnerabilities in your custom code, but they're also the team that is aligned to development. How does that work? How do they interact, and who's responsible for container security? Who's responsible for this cloud security? I think that's a transition, but I'm seeing more and more of these product security teams, which I like, so which takes a different lens on it. It's not a tech separation. It's the statement of who's securing the application and who is securing the infrastructure. And I think that's a healthier split. And I think Brendan and Toast, who stuck to the application security side, but he, I think, defined their definitions, I think, are pretty good if you want to check them out. That's the org structure. And then the other theme that really kind of arrived is about skills and reskilling. My favorite episode around reskilling was Roland Cloutier, who I mentioned before from XADP. And he, in a variety of conversations, including that conversation I mentioned from Justin Somaini, we talked about sort of turnover. And a lot of people talk about how they hire into their teams today, people with coding skills and with more of a developer empathy. A lot of them, Sasha Faust from Lyft and Amazon, a lot of mentions about how you need some amount of empathy to developers and some amount of coding skills to deal with this new surrounding where you need to be building tools to help secure software, and you need to be working through developers. You're not doing the work yourself. But then what I loved about Roland's episode is he talked about reskilling. So not just about who you hire, but they have a whole program about reskilling the team. And what I liked about it is the forward-looking aspect of it. So if you have a large security team, as they did in ADP, which I think was in the thousands, it's a very large team, then you have to think ahead and say, well, if I don't want to just turn over this team, many of them are amazing, kind of talented individuals, you want to start reskilling them now in batches as you transform your enterprise. Even if only a portion of your tech is maybe now in cloud and maybe in this new surrounding, still, you need to start thinking ahead, putting the training, putting the education alongside these new hirings. And I really, really liked that setup. So all of those are kind of this realization that DevSecOps is about more than just the tech. It's about the actual org structure and the changes. I guess on a positive note, if you think about what this has done to ops, it's been all goodness. You basically had sysadmins turn into SREs, and their salaries doubled, and they're definitely very impactful to the organization. Their impact scaled up. So something along those lines is hopefully happening to security.
Yeah, well, sounds like some really excellent changes coming in, which is great to see. And I think a lot of what you mentioned here are, of course, planned changes that we want to make. And of course, let's address the elephant in the room, as it were, and talk about what's happened that wasn't planned over this year. When we did the 2019 summary, we were, of course, in the London office and we did this podcast across a desk. We're right now over Zoom. And COVID has had an impact on the way we've all had to make changes in the way we work. With DevSecOps and security in general being so reliant on the relationships across teams, between people, individuals, how has the COVID impact and the changes that's made into our workplace, how's that affected the way we do work together and integrate as one team?
Yeah, COVID was super interesting, from a security lens perspective, beyond the shock that everybody went through, including security people, especially in organizations that weren't as used to working remotely. For us, I think it was a bit easier, just being kind of more remote friendly from the outset. But it was a bit of a shock. It was also interesting, I don't know how many listeners know this, but there's typically a lag of a bunch of weeks, between the time we record an episode and the time it airs. Sometimes it's shorter, but then it was also interesting just to even see the delta between kind of statements and learnings as a world community, really, not just a security community that might have happened in just a few weeks between a recording and publishing. So it was definitely an interesting experience just from a podcast production perspective, even before we started anything else. It came up a lot about challenges. I think the first and most obvious challenge that happened in security was the getting used to remote work. So this is, you see, as an industry, it's a little bit less about developers, but it has become the top priority for people. And that sort of securing surroundings, doing things like zero trust networks really came up, or cloud access security brokers, kind of CASPs, all of those topics as organizations just adapted to everybody being remote. And even if you supported remote employees before, suddenly you need to put more emphasis on the sort of security responsibility or security impact of how they do their work, and if their home computer is compromised, etc. So that was one topic that I think it was just a shift of priorities. I feel most organizations perceived it as a step forward. These are things that they wanted to do anyway. Everybody wanted these sort of zero trust surrounding, or wanted more self-sufficient services. So all the conversations I had about it were, yes, we have to shuffle and we had to drop a few things off the priority list to get this done, but it is a good piece of work, even if we eventually kind of get back to working in the office. So that was one. The second thing that talks about COVID, or that COVID kind of touched on, is the notion of relationships. And there was a lot of commentary about trust. And you could see this, I don't want to sort of start naming names, but different guests might have come from a place in which they already had established trust between the development team and the security teams, and they were basically reaping the benefits of it. They weren't worried that developers were circumventing things or were not thinking about security. They weren't reliant maybe so much on hallway chatter and being able to look over someone's shoulder. And so I think it just demonstrated and highlighted how important that trust is, that you're not a dictator, that you're not a controller as a security team, but rather you are a partner, right? And now you're here to help the development team build secure versus to force anybody to be secure. And a variety of other investments like automation and visibility, all of those DevOps-ish type investments basically paid off in the surroundings. So the end result was those who already had it now kind of valued it and ripped the benefits. And I think we're able to move faster. And those who didn't tried to now accelerate building it out. But trust is not something you can just easily accelerate. The automation thing, you can. So there's more emphasis there. We also saw that in the sort of the Snyk business impact, right? As people really invested in automation and dev-friendly tools. And then maybe just like a little bit of a rosy, sort of a positive note for a bunch of people. COVID presented an opportunity to structure some relationships in a positive way that they didn't have before. The two that I liked best was, if I keep coming back to Adrian, he just gave a lot of great nuggets. He set up office hours at Atlassian for people to talk to, which is much easier. It's just at a lower cost now that everybody's remote. There's no overhead to meeting individuals. So we set those up so people will come in with specific questions. Ryan Ware at Intel talked about how we set up these 15-minute stand-ups, or sort of, quick syncs with people, where again, previously he relied on maybe a little bit more sort of random conversations that might have occurred. So people did use this as an opportunity to just create a more frequent conversation with different people between security and dev, which I thought was a very positive thing.
Really interesting. And I think COVID, while it does bring many, many challenges that we do all have to kind of get around, not just from a security space, of course, I really do find that what you mentioned there about the split between people who have adopted the more modern practices, reaping those rewards, and those who haven't, trying to accelerate that. I find that very interesting in terms of how you can create those relationships that build that trust when you are all remote. That must be so, so hard to do without being in the office, without trying to create those new processes, create those new bonds together. That must be extremely challenging. Let's move on, because I know we've done almost 25 minutes on the first question. So let's go to the second question, and maybe we'll have time for a third guy.
There was a lot of meat to it, though. It's the key
there
learning
was.
here, so, yeah.
Absolutely. No, really, really, really great summary. Now, we've had a huge number of guests on, and you're name dropping a fair bit, which is getting a little bit embarrassing. It's amazing, right? You're name dropping some great people, and it's just testament to the number of amazing people that we've had on. And we have great feedback from a lot of our listeners about what they learn from some of the top people, what works and what doesn't work in their environment. So what about you, Guy? What have you learned from the guests, and what experiences have you gleaned from their experiences?
Again, kind of the short answer is like a ton. I feel this is what I love about the podcast. It's like this best job. I get to basically ask smart people with great experiences questions that are of interest to me, and I learn from their answers. So I learn a lot. I try to think about kind of condensing it to a few sort of specific practices that really, I think, shaped some of my thinking after I've heard them. One that comes to mind is Shannon Leitz's conversation about securability. So Shannon Leitz runs the red team at Intuit, and she's, longtime DevSecOps advocate. And she talked about how you can use a 4 nines measure to measure security. And that's a really interesting approach. She talked about that and about the importance of measuring exploitability and kind of weighing exploitability, that, issues that her team might find prove to be exploitable. How do they feed them into the system? So what I liked about it is, there was a whole kind of challenge around measuring security through the episodes. But what I liked about this approach of the 4-9 is that it can be rolled up really well, because you have this sort of 4 nines measure. Now you can have a weighted average across projects, across risks, which I really, really liked. So that one is definitely how I'm thinking. And in fact, Patrick Dubois and myself at Snyk here, we're sort of thinking about structuring something and building there. So stay tuned for that. So that one I loved, definitely sort of changed my view on metrics.
And on that, who do you feel that will really help them most? Because I know developers are obviously trying to spend as much time as they can building and testing and things like that. Will this kind of thing help them to almost state the importance of spending that time on security? Or is it more for maybe the security teams to be able to show the value that they're injecting into the projects?
Well, a good metric should help all of the above. And the idea is to really measure what you intuitively value. So being able to actually measure a combination of your risk and the way that you're handling that risk. But I do think that the 4 nines measure has an extra added value, that it has some intrinsic affinity or familiarity because of uptime. I think most developers, most ops people are familiar with sort of 99.95% up or things like that. So I think it has an added advantage for dev and DevOps to appreciate that metric. But fundamentally, it has to be broadly applicable. Otherwise, it's not a good metric. It needs to be measured by everybody. It needs to be valued by everybody. That's for measuring. One tip that I got on the episode, from him himself, but also in reference was, again, from Adrian Ludwig. He talked about the whole journey that mobile security underwent to rethink security, and how cloud security represents that opportunity for us to sort of rethink application security. And I loved that thesis. Mobile security has indeed successfully rethought operating system security. It is dramatically more secure than the desktop operating systems that we have, because it rethought some of the fundamentals. And so taking that lens to cloud security is something I find very inspiring, thinking about how, if we got it right, we can really properly encapsulate every microservice. We can automate more things. So if we took the right approach to cloud native AppSec, we don't need to just match or keep up with security. We can leapfrog. We can really do something that is spectacular. And he referenced Google's Beyond Prod, which is a model that is interesting, that tries to define this. But I think even more than that, I was just inspired by the vision. So I really like that. I really like this notion of, don't just think about how do you catch up to the cloud. Think about how can cloud help you rethink security and not be stuck with sort of yesterday's problem. So I liked that. I think I already mentioned security champions, but one of the models I liked also was on the other side, which is this notion of AppSec partnering. This came up, I think, even last year from Envision with Sarah Danek there was talking about how they're modeled in this partner program. The penny that dropped to me in these conversations is the duality of security champions and AppSec partners. On one side, you have people on the AppSec side partnering with a sequence of engineering teams or sort of application teams. So on one hand, it's a good relationship because those AppSec people, they have a relationship with the leads in those application teams, and so they can collaborate better. But also on the security team, that AppSec person knows more about the applications than maybe the rest of their team about these specific applications. And then security champions is reversed. Those security champions, again, act as a bit of a liaison to the security team, but also amongst their application teams, they know more about security. So I find that model really, really, really nice. That wasn't really one takeaway. It was more an aggregation of these different models. And then I guess the last one I'll give is like a little bit more tactical, but very concrete, which is Tad Whitaker at Circle CI. He had a very positive spin on compliance. We keep talking about compliance as this as this negative, like it's good to be compliant. But from a security perspective, oftentimes it's perceived as security theater or something that you do because you have to. Tad came with a very refreshing approach early in the year. In our conversation, I think was maybe even pre-COVID, and talked about how they used FedRAMP. He gave specific concrete tips about how to achieve FedRAMP compliance, but also had a very positive approach to how FedRAMP is a great way to raise awareness to security and how everybody can rally around a business enabler or a business opportunity to be FedRAMP compliant and therefore be able to sell into sort of the federal government. And that's really great. And in fact, Thomas Orkin here at Snyk, who's our head of security, he actually came with the sort of the same approach, a little bit later in the year when we had that conversation. So I really liked that. I think I got a little bit absorbed in that critical view maybe of compliance. I think that shakeup was a positive. So anyways, there's probably dozens more, but those are the ones that come to mind.
And it's interesting, that last one that you mentioned. It's great to hear that even here at Snyk, we're taking these and we're actually implementing them. A lot of some of the, not just concepts, but some of the more concrete tips that people mention, and actually implement them in our org as well. While we have guests that have a lot of great oversight across their organizations in the security space and beyond, but when we think about what people can actually take away, like that last example you mentioned on compliance, what people can actually take away and implement themselves, what other concrete tips or methodologies would you say you really found useful for people to take away and do themselves at their own orgs?
Probably every episode has a bit of a nice nugget there, but one that comes to mind is Nitsan from Spotify, she's new to security. She came into security from Agile and from testing. So she started her journey by doing this survey of what is the state of application security or product security at Spotify. And then the trick I loved is that she then used the response to the survey as a means to identify her best allies. So the people that were most excited to give her input, to share their views, who were sort of keen to make sure that their views were heard. Naturally, those are the people that cared the most about security within the development team. And so the learning process, the survey, was actually a great tee up for identifying her champions, her leads, as she said about growing that. So I love that trick. I think it works everywhere. And in fact, she brought it into security from past experience. So that's a great one to use. It's so simple, and yet so few companies do it. I love this notion of 10x and how Neil and team there put vulnerability burn down charts as part of their daily Scrum meetings. And so not a lot of teams in general show burn down charts of things in daily Scrums, but still whatever recurring metrics that you're showing security there is just a natural tenant, I think is a really easy step. It's nothing, it's add a chart. Don't put all your security metrics there, put one. But it just raises security into the daily conversations, and security visibility is also important. I found that to be a great, great trick. So that's another one I'll share. I think maybe more on the enterprise side, Wendy Nag from Experian, she had a nice approach. She was rolling out, I think that journey is a challenging journey to embed DevSecOps in Experian, but she took this approach where she identified the teams that were doing best. Instead of saying, this is the way you should do it, she identified the teams that did DevOps best and DevSecOps best. And then she interviewed them and basically introduced those practices to other teams that were not doing as well. So instead of her coming and saying, this is the way it should be, she identified the ones that are doing it best. And that, in a large enough org, there will definitely be a wide variety. and approach that. So I like that because it was proven to work. These are methodologies that are proving to work inside your organization and scale that. Larry Mascheroni from Comcast, who had this incredible podcast about data, he had a bit of a similar kind of gradual approach. He did a bit more centrally identify like several dozens of metrics of practices that should be rolled out as part of the DevSecOps rollout, but he didn't go off and say, and you need to do all 40 of them, but rather said, okay, I think it was like 10 of them. Let's get those done. And then when one of them was achieved, the average threshold, everybody was achieving them. Now you say, well, now everybody else is doing this correctly. So there's no real reason for you to say it cannot be achieved, this level of success on this practice. So now that's kind of set up. Let's ensure that that's a requirement for everybody and add another one that we're leveling up, pick another one of those dozens to build up. So it's outside the podcast, but I had someone phrase it correctly, which is security needs to be ahead of where the rest of the org is. Like the bar should be ahead of where you are. So it pulls you up, but not so far ahead that it's out of reach, right? That people are not inspired by it. So I like that. Yeah, I think those are the concrete ones. I already mentioned security chaos engineering, which I love. So if you're using chaos engineering, adding security chaos engineering attacks into it is a great tip.
Excellent. So let's move on to a question which we also asked last year, which is around what security and development teams are doing particularly well today and where we feel they need to improve.
It's always tough because to an extent, we get slightly more forward-thinking security leaders on the podcast. It's people, there's a bit of a selection bias of people coming on the podcast that they're on this journey to embed development. But still, I feel the whole narrative of security as an enabler, move away from the kind of controlling dictatorial model and think about security as a service provider, as an enabler, as an empowering entity succeeding through developers. That came out far stronger this year. Guests volunteered it, they suggested that this is how they work. Also, many of them didn't necessarily think about that being unusual. People kind of mentioned this as like, obviously, this is how we think. So there's definitely a momentum about it. Also had some interesting conversations about this from large organizations that are more decentralized. Ian at Simpress was a good example that comes to mind, where they're literally a service provider to a whole bunch of different business units who are quite autonomous. And so really kind of took that approach to the next level, which I thought was really nice.
And do you feel like that is largely because these are just the fruits of hard work that's occurred over the last year or two? Or do you feel like there's a greater shift in the way we're working, which is causing this almost change in our thinking of the way things work?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a need and the art of the possible. I think on one hand, you're seeing a need. You see that DevOps is happening. People are running faster and faster, that you're unable to control or dictate to them. And so you sort of see that methodology and maybe even experience that the pieces where you are, even if not intended, acting more as an enabler, they're picking up more support. But still, like the need, the fact that the previous approach, so the carrot and stick here, the stick is happening where people are circumventing security teams, not embracing this approach, or those security teams are just getting burned out because they just can't keep up. They can't live it up. And on the flip side, I think what you're seeing is you're seeing a lot more examples and demonstrations of things that are working. I'd like to think the podcast is one of those means, and DevSecOn as a community sharing and demonstrating where some security leaders who have found techniques that work share that with the rest of the world. And I think, so you see the alternative, it's working there. And I feel like there's an increasing number of capable people, security sort of staff, who would basically not come work for a team that works in a different way. So I think you also see a little bit of the talent push. And there have been several mentions of people who have left previous jobs because it wasn't that surrounding. That was just a bit of a doomed to fail if you don't embrace this approach. So a bit of a combination. There's also been, I think still on the working well side, there's been a lot of emphasis on communication. And it really came along throughout. I think that was actually even the primary theme of Douglas Perry, who was a Datadog. I think it was even his primary emphasis on communication, this thesis of if you communicate well, good things will come from working between dev and security. So I think that also, if you communicate better, development tells you, this is what we need. We need you to not tell us, we need you to help us do these things ourselves. So that's the patting ourselves on the back piece. Oftentimes we sort of think about what's not working well. So we're going to talk a little bit about cloud security. I don't want to sort of belabor that point too much, but I think cloud security right now is a mess and needs work. So that's probably a piece that definitely is tough. I think it's a little bit tough because there is a little bit of a job security element to it. When you talk about cloud security, containers were a new thing. They came onto the scene. They weren't threatening anybody's job, who I've been doing this for 10 years now. Someone needs to do it. When you think about cloud security, if you think about like asset management and IT security and who's managing the networks, there's actually a bigger shift or a bigger risk for people thinking they need to reskill and they might not be able to. So I think there's a bit more clinging to your current position. But also, frankly, containers are smaller than cloud security is just a bigger topic. So I think that one's a mess. And as I said, I don't think it's going to be a one-year thing. And then the other one, which I think I actually mentioned in 2019 as well, is measuring security. And it's amazing how nobody has cracked that nut. Talked about it a ton. We talked about data. We had Larry Masharon. You have to, if you haven't listened to that episode, you really have to go back. Probably is the best example I've seen on measuring security and how it's rolled out in the organization. He has some interesting insights about how practices might have surprised you. For instance, on how if you invest in finding vulnerabilities, but you don't improve or you don't invest in fixing vulnerabilities, your security posture is measured by a variety of risk indicators for him. It's actually worse. You actually get worse. Even though you know about more, you just have this sort of false sense that you've invested already and you don't fix it. Versus if you invest in find and fix, then you're actually doing better. And there's a whole world of those insights. So that was probably the closest, but it's still miles away. We had ecosystem data session. We had Alisa Miller and Gareth Rushgrove from Snyk, and we had Alana Brown from Puppet. We talked about ecosystem data. So I think we've gotten a little bit better at kind of measuring ourselves as an ecosystem, but measuring one's security, like an organization security status and practices, I think that is still very, very messy. I find, as I start to sense patterns from the different episodes, I find that eventually people boil down to one of three primary measures, which are either the one or more. They can use one or all of those three. One is that they might be measuring their risk level. How many vulnerabilities do I have? Is the simplest example of it. The second thing is that they are measuring security controls efficacy. How often was something blocked, right? Or how often was an issue discovered? So that's more about sort of the effectiveness of the control itself. And that's more judge your vendors or kind of, measure whether you're using the right tools or not, if you should swap. And then the third, which I think is actually the most popular, is that people are not measuring so much security as adoption, which is they're saying, I've logically decided which security controls I need to have where. And really what I'm measuring is the rollout. I'm measuring how often is the security control in place. So I think that's probably the best I've got at the moment in terms of recurring themes around measuring security. But what's very clear is that we don't yet know how to measure it. And kind of the old adage of if you can't measure it, you can't optimize it, it comes to mind. So I think that's going to be holding us back. I know I personally expect to spend some time on it this coming year. And I think it's a topic that the industry continues to think about and to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And very complex, just from the sheer number of things that you could measure as well as what you can reliably take as a result from those measurements.
Absolutely. And it's hard, isn't it? Security, measuring security is invisible. Like risk is this murky thing. And so there's a reason it's hard. It's not that people aren't trying or aren't smart, it's just a tough problem.
So let's look forward now and go into what we feel is going to be happening in 2021. In terms of some of the biggest security risks and challenges that you feel that our future guests are going to face in their organizations, what do you feel are going to be, and I can almost even foresee some of the answers here from what you've already said. How do you feel our guests going into 2021 are going to be most concerned with going into their organizations?
Yeah, and I think I've been I've been sort of alluding to a bunch of those because none of this is not like in 2020 you're done and then in 2021 you're doing something else. But so from a practical perspective, from a specific technologies, I think the one that's going to be at the top is this whole notion of cloud security. DevOps will accelerate. And cloud would be used more. It would go from 10 to 20 to 50% of your stack of your applications. It's going to be an immediate burning problem. And also as infrastructure as code gets adopted, I think that's going to be a theme. So I would expect, first of all, cloud security as a whole will come up, but specifically infrastructure as code, as applications use more cloud, then they would increasingly find that they find a problem when it is deployed and they want to move it earlier. And lo and behold, that earlier is in the Terraform script that sits in the repository. And so today, when you talk to organizations, which I do a ton of, I talk to hundreds of organizations every year, most of them don't have a good structured way to identify security mistakes as part of their infrastructure as code, scripts, and processes early on. So I think that's going to change, in this year, and we're seeing a lot of industry movement there. So I think that's probably at the top. The second one, I guess, is measuring security. I don't think that 2021 is a special year for this, except for volume. It's just like there's going to be more activity. And so the impact of measuring security is going to grow. So we talked about that. And then I think the last one that comes to mind is really the security team split that I mentioned before. It's not just an evolution. It's really important. People need to have the right affinity, the skill sets change. I do think 2021 is going to be a pivotal year in terms of defining those elements. Those are, I think, the three top ones.
So to get some good guests on in 2021 then, Guy, to talk about this, who do we need to recruit to talk about these topics? Who would be your ideal dinner party group of guests to talk
do
about
those
these topics? Yeah.
Well, I guess it ends up touching on similar. So definitely anybody who sort of feels like they have some good insights on measuring security, would love to talk to them in general and to bring them on the podcast to share those. I think it's an area where nobody has a solution, but we need to piecemeal it together. We need to have everybody share this trick they found and that trick they're found. And I'm happy to be a platform to help get all those pieces and then eventually sort of create the whole picture. So definitely would love to get insights about that. And I guess also the security team structure. I already asked probably every guest that starts, how do they structure their security organization? But if you've evolved your security organization, would love to talk to people about it. Notably in larger organizations, I think it's a little bit, I'm saying this with all due respect as someone growing a company here at Snyk as well in hypergrowth, but it's a little bit easier when you're a cloud native organization, you're forming your organization this way. It's much harder to restructure your team when you already have hundreds of people in that organization and they have different skills. So would love to hear those types of stories. The second topic is indeed on the cloud native side. I think what we haven't discussed as much is the runtime side of things. Alongside the changes of moving the infrastructure definitions into dev, another thing that is happening is that the NOC and the SOC are coming together closely. You see security offerings in the APM space like Datadogs and Elastic, kind of becoming more sort of SIEM-like functionality. And so that's cross-pollination, the incident response of security versus the incident response of an outage. How and if should those be related? I think those are really interesting topics. I'd love to talk to a few more guests about those types of changes. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I would say is a bit more about community than it is about a topic, which is I'd love to have a more diverse guest list. We feel running this podcast and looking for sort of, experienced guests to bring on really places you sort of face front, in front of the diversity problem we have in the industry. And you just sort of see how many sharp organizations you look for, female or other diverse leaders of those security organizations, and there just aren't enough of them. So I think a part of it is you can become what you can see type notion. A part of it is historical baggage, right? So even if we're better as an industry in hiring juniors that are, more evenly split, people that have experience is a little bit of yesterday's mistakes that lead us here. But still, I'm quite committed to making that investment. So if you know of bright women who have a security perspective, whether they work on security, and not just women, sort of diverse guests to have as a whole who can share kind of a good lens on security, whether they come from the ops side or the dev side or the security side, but on these topics, I would absolutely love to see that. Or, by the way, talk about diversity initiatives. We had Tad Whitaker, Circle CI, I mentioned before. He also created and runs a Shecurity, which is a great org initiative to actually help women get into security. You talked about this with Vandana Verma, talked about it with Elisa, talked about their initiatives, but I would love to raise those up. I think we need to talk about it. We need to find opportunities to both give airtime to the problem. And once again, just like the measuring and just like all those others, inch our way towards a solution, find the right practices that make it work and go from there.
Really, really important problem. So really valuable to bring up and talk about. So that's great to hear. So Guy, over the last year as well, you always or very often talk to people and ask people what piece of advice they'd give to the listeners, what their pet peeve would be. So let's throw that question at you. What would your one piece of advice or pet peeve be across the whole of 2020 that really still grates you?
Oof. Yeah, I had a hard time reducing things to like 3 or 4 bullets, kind of getting it down to 1. But I guess it is kind of my own doing here.
How about this? How about you name 10 and I'll cut you off after the first one? How's that?
I don't think I can say listen to the podcast, although that's a good, if you're still here, you probably are. I would say don't boil the ocean. I encounter a lot of angst from people saying, I would love to be there, but in my org, it's really hard. Similarly, I encounter like a lot of paralysis by analysis. No, we're trying to design this perfect new reality into which we will move security and how we practice. And I feel that's just not the way DevOps and Agile works. And you can be stuck in that world until you basically have a really big fire and you have to rebuild the house. And so my advice would be, pick something and get started, whether it's cultural about hiring a new team, whether it's a piece of technology automation that you want to put in, whether you want to introduce some automated fixes to sort of a specific security threat, or put a measure in your stand-up meetings. Just pick something. You don't have to have a massive, complete, holistic program. Once you hit some critical mass, you can go off and you can scale it. You can do it in parallel, but don't boil the ocean. Pick something and get started moving security down the right journey, whether it's a whole transformation or on specific technology space, like this sort of cloud native AppSec space.
Wonderful. So, Guy, that's the last question we have. So a big thank you to all your hard work and all the guests and topics that you've brought onto the podcast and discussed over the last year. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, I have a whole blast doing it. So for me, it's all upside.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And that, of course, is a wrap now for 2020. So we really do hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you very much to all for listening, following along, and also sharing amongst your colleagues and friends. This year, as everyone has, we have adapted with COVID, or to COVID, should I say. And one of the things that we've done is combined our community groups. So we had the My DevSecOps virtual group, as well as the DevSecCon physical conferences. And we've combined both of them together to make just one DevSecCon brand, and that brings the secure developer into the DevSecCon family. So as part of DevSecCon, we will continue in future to do physical in-person events, as well as many of the virtual meetup and programs that we do at DevSecCon website. So in 2020, we'll be bringing you a whole load more content as well on this podcast, as well, of course, as many more different types of programs on the DevSecCon community platform. So, of course, please do let us know if you have any feedback or comments, or if there's anything else you want to see or hear about at info@devseccon.com. And with that,
even in 2021, it's like I think you said 2020 here. So even in 2021, we'll do the.
See, yeah, still living in the past. Yeah, absolutely. 2020. Thank you very much, Guy. Anything you want to leave us with?
No, just thanks everybody for listening in, and really, you make this happen and be vocal. Share your views, what you like, what you dislike, and we'll adapt accordingly. So Wonderful. Thank you very much, and have a happy new year.
See you all in 2021.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.